All right, good morning, RBL. So, Mike polled everybody, and the training for this morning is going to be on target behaviors. So, we all have these in our BSPs, obviously, so it would behoove us to know what they are and how to utilize them. So, I know we go over this a lot, but when we think of target behaviors, there's two key terms that come to mind, very important. Does anybody know what they are? Go ahead, Mike.
One's observable, I'm going to say.
Okay. So, oh, go ahead, Curlin. All right, perfect. Can you skip ahead one? All right. So, observable and measurable, very, very important. As ABA practitioners, we have to look at behavior scientifically. When you have a chemist in the lab, they will take a chemical, apply pressure, apply heat, all sorts of different things. But if you don't know what you're studying and it's not accurate, your data is going to be skewed. So, if we kind of look at behavior scientifically instead of philosophically, it'll get us closer to having our terms and our definitions on point so that our data collection's on point, which is one of the most important things we do. When we're dealing with, some of us have technicians that go out on our cases with us, some of us don't, but we all have caregivers, other staff members. If our behavior or our target behaviors are not observable and measurable, how can we expect, our technicians, how can we expect caregivers to help us out when we're not there to record that data? And then by extension, we have a bunch of stakeholders that we're accountable to, whether that's, SCs, the county. They don't want to hear, sorry to say, but they don't want to hear about our feelings or our judgments. They want to see our data, and that justifies our practice and us being there. So that's why I found that meme. It's our data can disprove assumptions about ABA because in the past, you know, ABA has maybe gotten a bad rap as most of disciplines, in counseling, psychology, because some not good things were done in the past in the name of science. So we need to help kind of promote a good outlook for our discipline by showing, hey, here's our data, this is why it works. And to do that, we need to make sure what we're targeting is observable and measurable at all times. So I ripped these right out of one of my BSPs just to give kind of an example of target behaviors. So first one's physical aggression. Now, it just says when client is denied access to desired items, activities, or given an aversive request, client may slap with an open hand, repeatedly slam a closed fist on surfaces, bite, headbutt, or engage in property destruction, defined as throwing items, food, and punching holes in walls, because in the past, this behavior granted client access to items, activities, or aversive requests to be removed. Now, the other one that I put, same BSP, it's pro loquo. So this falls under functional communication training. Instead of resorting to verbally or physically aggressive behavior to meet his needs, client will generalize the usage of his adaptive equipment device, his iPad, across environments and people. Because right now he kind of thinks it's for school. So getting him to understand that, hey, this is beneficial at home, in the community, as well as school, that's where we want to get him to. So this is a topic for, you could have a whole semester long class on this. What is behavior? So the definition that's given in Cooper, which is our seminal text for ABA, I highly suggest. It is a little steep, but I'm pretty sure, Mike, you have one if people need to borrow it.
Yeah, I do. I have an extra copy.
Reference it all the time. But the definition that Cooper gives for behavior is that portion of an organism's interaction with its environment that involves movement of some part of the organism. I just pulled up another article that I read lately that was trying to sort of like nail down what behavior is. And always obviously stick with Cooper, but this kind of gives you an idea of how broad a definition of behavior can be. Lazari states that it's the occurrence of an organism's action or reaction. You have a class or a pattern that occurs. You have group behavior. That's another thing. We generally don't deal with that in our practice here at RBL, but there's a whole field of ABA that's involved in group behavior. And then a change or movement of an organism. And, obviously, Mike always says the dead man's test. What if we're asking what is a behavior? If a dead man can do it, probably not a behavior.
What's an example of a dead man test behavior?
So if you have someone just lying down, a dead man can do that, but that doesn't involve any movement or any interaction with the environment per se. So therefore, it's not a behavior. Because if we go back to that example or that definition, an organism's action or reaction or involving movement of some part of the organism. And just keep in mind when we speak about an organism, many different, plants, animals, people, we're all capable of behaviors. But that's why we say organism, but you can just think of it as a person for our, for the sake of our scope of practice. But a dead man can't, if they're just laying, they're not interacting with the environment, they're not moving. So therefore, it's not a behavior.
Thank you.
Okay, so a big concept when we're talking about, target behaviors and defining what those behaviors are, operational definitions. Operational definitions. Okay, we need to make sure when we are writing our service plans that any definitions that we come up with, they have to be able to be interpreted by both professionals like other BSCs, your BCBA, your techs, also have to be able to be interpreted by lay people, meaning that client's caregivers, other staff members, some of our clients have nurses, they need to understand what we're speaking about too. So I'll take that back to 7 dimensions of ABA. What dimension of ABA does that cover? Does anybody want to take a stab at that one?
Any guesses?
Oh, it's so hard for me to see. Yeah, good job, Grace. Technological. Yes, even though interprofessionally in ABA, we do need to be using a set standard of terms to refer so that we're all on the same page. We also can't expect everybody to be using those terms or to take the time out of their day to learn those terms. So we need to make sure that while our definitions are effective and precise, anybody that reads our BSPs should be able to understand what we're speaking about. So therefore, it's got to be clear and concise. You don't want to have it, and I hate to say it this way, but it's not the time for us to flex our creative writing skills. No matter how good we might be at that, it's not the time for that. It should be clinical in nature, very objective, removed from the situation. We're not looking at, anything subjective. Or, like I said, they're not concerned with our feelings or our personal judgments. It's a very, removed clinical disposition. And it also has to describe all aspects of the behavior, not only parts of it, because that will go back to our data collection. If we're not capturing a complete picture, our data is not going to be complete. But it is important to note that sometimes we can be tracking a behavior, take like physical aggression. That individual might be slapping, they may start punching. If that ends up happening, like if a new aspect of a behavior emerges while, we're developing treatment, you got to update it in the BSP. That it's a living document. We all update our BSPs on the regular. If a new behavior, like a new aspect of that behavior is manifesting, that we're starting to see this, okay, then we got to update that, because then it can be included in that target definition, and then everybody's tracking all aspects of it, not just, piecemeal parts of it.
You would update that in Central Reach too, right?
Absolutely. Yep. Yeah. So just take it right from, your document, switch it right over to Central Reach. It's super fast and easy. So next, I just have a quick a quick video about operational definitions, like 2 minutes long, but the lady in the video says it way better than I can. Oh, I don't think it's her. It's just
Welcome, future behavioural analysts. Today, we dive into a world where every action, every behaviour is defined, measured and understood based on clear, observable and measurable terms. This is the playground of operational definitions of behaviour. These definitions are the cornerstone of behavioural research, offering a structure for the objective identification, documentation and examination of behaviours. But you must be wondering, how do we establish these operational definitions? It's a task that requires precision, clarity and consistency. Firstly, we pinpoint the behaviour. What specific action or event are we aiming to define and observe? It should be something that can be observed and measured objectively. Following that, we depict the behaviour. This involves creating an illustrative image of the behaviour using precise, unambiguous language, focusing on specific actions, gestures or expressions. After that, we determine the measurement criteria. How are we going to measure or quantify this behaviour? We might count the frequency of the behaviour or measure its duration. If we have multiple observers, we train them. We provide clear guidelines and training to ensure they can identify and note down the defined behaviour consistently. Before immersing ourselves in the actual observation or data gathering, we conduct a pilot test. This is our chance to refine the operational definition and verify its clarity. And then we're ready to conduct our observations. We put into action the established operational definition, observing and documenting the behaviour according to the defined criteria. Finally, we dissect and interpret the data. We use relevant statistical or qualitative methods to draw insightful conclusions about the behaviour under study. As budding behavioural analysts, let's consider an operational definition of a maladaptive behaviour such as aggression in a hypothetical student named John Doe. Aggression could be defined as any instance of John Doe making physical contact with another person using his body or an object with enough force to cause an audible sound and or leave a visible mark on the skin. This could include biting, hitting, kicking or throwing objects. Now that you, as future behavioural analysts, have seen the process, why not try it for yourself? Choose a behaviour, define it, measure it, and see what you can learn. The world of operational definitions of behaviour is a fascinating one, and there's always more to discover.
Sorry, I couldn't, like we were saying, I was having trouble embedding it in the PPT. So moving on from operational definitions, we have several categories of behaviors. It's like, okay, well now I have the definition that's, it's clear, it's concise, it's operational. What do we want to do with that behavior? Because obviously we're not just observers, we provide interventions. So first type would be weakening. So you would have a behavior that you would want to weaken. This is simply a behavior that occurs in overabundance. But that doesn't necessarily mean it's a harmful behavior in and of itself. It's just when it's taken to excess, it can cause problems or detrimental effects in that person's life. So does anybody have an example of a behavior that's not necessarily harmful if done appropriately, but taken to excess can be detrimental?
Washing your hands for too long on your face.
That was the example I was going to give too. It's when you engage in hand washing, it's a positive behavior because you're cutting down on germs. It's a personal hygiene, sort of regimen. And that's great. But what if that person is doing that 15, 20 times a day for 5 minutes a day? That's taking up a substantial portion of that person's day. Or look at teeth brushing. We brush our teeth twice a day. Great. Do that 8 or 10 times a day and you'll wear the enamel off your teeth and then you have dental problems. Then we're dealing with a whole other, bunch of issues there. So like I said, so if you have a target behavior that you want to weaken. We just want to reduce it. We don't necessarily want to completely place it on extinction. We just want to weaken it to a point where it's not. Yes.
Oh, I was just gonna mention OCD type behaviors, right?
Which there is a lot of comorbidity there with autism, and there's those compulsive behaviors. I know in my own practice, I've had a client who he would have a completion ritual, especially with packs of hot dogs. He would give them to his mother 2 by 2 by 2 by 2, and then that's causing overeating and binge eating and stuff, and he was gaining a lot of weight. So we decided okay, let's put them in sandwich baggies of 2. That seemed to help, because when he eats the 2, now that package is it's complete. Whereas if it's a partial package, he feels that compulsion so strongly, he may just sit there, eat the whole package. And then, like I said, then you're dealing with, binge eating behaviors, and that's obviously not good. So, okay, so next one's replacing.
I love your use of
I saw that one, like that was a perfect example for this. Now this, we're specifically referring to inappropriate or harmful behaviors. Okay, that's your aggression, things like that. If someone understands, like, you don't have to tantrum, you don't have to get aggressive in order to have your needs met. What we would suggest is, okay, we're going to take this maladaptive behavior, such as aggression, and then we're going to replace that with functional communication, teaching that person that, hey, this is a lower energy, less consequences involved in order to, same outcome, but it doesn't have the detrimental effects of, someone getting hurt or, causing a scene in public or things like that. So that's behaviors that you would want to replace. Now, the next category, and this is going to be kind of related to the one after it, but strengthening behaviors. These are behaviors that should be occurring more often. They do occur, but they're not occurring as often as they need to. And it's very important that we understand the client has to already possess that prerequisite skill to engage in that terminal response. So when we're talking about terminal responses, response and behavior in this context, they're interchangeable. So a terminal behavior or a terminal response is simply our end product. If you want someone to wash the dishes and they can already wash the dishes, you would want to strengthen that behavior, okay? Whether through different types of reinforcement, what have you, that's something you talk with your BCBA about. There's a lot of subjective factors in there with the client, motivations, whatever, but the most important part is they have to already have that skill in place. Then on the other side of that, we have developing skills. That's implemented when they do not have that prerequisite skill to engage in that terminal response. So if we're going to develop a skill, we need to start shaping that behavior, either through, shaping procedures, chaining procedures. We need to make sure that we're teaching those prerequisite skills or those steps to getting to that terminal behavior or that terminal response. We have to make sure that we're taking them along the steps of that process to get them there. So if we want to develop a skill, we're starting from scratch sometimes. Maybe not. Sometimes part of it's there, part of it's missing. But if they can't complete that terminal response, then we want to develop the skill. Now, the next two, these are also sort of opposite to one another. So generalization, we talk about, or generality, but when we're talking about generalization, what are we talking about?
Any guesses?
It can be used in all different environments.
Right. So if we have a skill that, it's a skill that's already occurring, we want to be able to take that skill and apply it in different situations. And what Cooper lists as the 3 different components of that is across people, across environments, and across materials. So you may have a behavior that it will occur with mom, but not with dad, a behavior that'll occur at school, but not at home, or materials is a little more difficult to explain, but the biggest example I can give is if you have somebody that can tie a bow in their shoe, but not a bow in their hair, that's across materials. So, if we're dealing with a deficit where the behavior will occur, it's just not occurring in all aspects that it's most effective. So on the other side of that, we have stimulus control. So just to define that, according to Cooper, it's a situation in which frequency, latency, duration, or amplitude of a behavior that's altered by the presence or absence of an antecedent stimulus. That just means that in the presence or absence of this stimulus, the behavior will or will not occur. So when a behavior is reliably presenting in that fashion, we say that it's considered to be under stimulus control. Now, we should be implementing this. If you have a behavior that's occurring across too many or inappropriate types of people or environments or materials, we want to kind of rein that in to a point where that person is engaging in that behavior in the right environment, with the right people, and with the right materials. Does anybody have any questions about that one? Because that's a, yes. Okay, so let's see. A lot of our clients have deficits with stranger awareness. Okay, they may run up to mom and dad, give them a big hug. And that's appropriate, that's your parents. But you can't really do that in public to a stranger for many different reasons. They might see that as a threat. They might try to exploit someone, the person might try to exploit our client. So we want to teach that person that it's appropriate in this situation, but not in this situation. And to do that, like I said, you want to have that behavior under stimulus control so that this stimulus, whether like mom and dad, this stimulus should produce this behavior. These stimuli, no. Or like with environments, you could have toileting. Okay, it's appropriate to urinate in the bathroom. But if someone's, urinating out in public or they're doing it in an otherwise inappropriate environment, we want to make sure that we teach them it's appropriate here, but it's not appropriate there. So we want to make sure that those sorts of behaviors are under stimulus control. Did that help?
Yes.
Okay.
Example.
Okay, so the last one's maintenance. This is the destination for all of our interventions. We want to get behaviors to a point where they're being engaged in, and we've thinned our schedule of reinforcement, we've prompt faded, and it's more or less smooth sailing from that point. But that does not imply that behavior will never happen again, that you never have to touch it again, because at any point you could have a spontaneous recovery. So does anybody know what spontaneous recovery is? It's kind of in the definition. The word's in the definition.
Is that when like an old behavior crops up?
Yes. Yes.
To become like stronger.
Yeah. So and it's not well understood in the research, but we do know that it does happen. It's considered a phenomenon, and it can happen for many different reasons. But out of, you could have a behavior that you have in maintenance for months or even years, and all of a sudden it creeps up to pre-intervention levels. We just have to be aware that does happen, and we have to be ready for that if it does happen, and then sort of address it appropriately and quickly. You don't want someone to just backslide into old habits because we weren't ready for that, or we didn't anticipate that. Yes.
So why is it important to categorize your target behavior
Well,
and consider that you're
Well, for one, I would say, again, I'll go back to what do we want to do with these behaviors? You know, okay, we have a behavior. We don't just, yes, observation's a big part of our job, but it's what do we do with our observations? And, you know, also the category that you choose will have some influence on what method of data collection you use. So, you know, if you have a behavior that, let's say, the strengthening behavior, okay, that you might want to track with a permanent product, meaning we know, I'll go back to the dishwashing example. We know if someone can wash the dishes, if they've washed the dishes, that's their permanent product. We don't necessarily need to track every single, oh, they washed five cups and 4 plates. No, they completed the task. Or you could have a behavior that you want to weaken, such as like Diego said with hand washing. Okay, well, it was at 15 times a day. We're going to track frequency and duration. Now it's like 5 times a day, you know. So that would be kind of, it helps infer your data collection as far as that goes.
Would it also like have help you kind of identify interventions to use?
Absolutely. Yeah. Because there are certain, when you're talking about strengthening behaviors, you know, you're going to have, that's more, you know, that informs what sort of reinforcement you're going to use for those behaviors, which we'll kind of get into with, you know, functional topographic definitions, because once we know those, also once we know the function of a behavior, it greatly informs how we treat that behavior. So there's 2 different types of target behavior definitions. So we have functional and we have topographical. Now, functional, I just want you to think it's why the behavior occurs, meaning what intended effect it produces on the environment. So someone's engaging in a behavior, why are they engaging in it? And it can also refer to a certain setting, an event, an antecedent, or a consequence, meaning Johnny engages in elopement when dad tells him to take out the trash. Therefore, you know, you're referring to the function of that is escape, but it's in response to a consequence or a certain antecedent. That is your functional target behavior. And then we want to incorporate that when, okay, if that behavior, if we're tracking it and it's reliably occurring in the presence of those certain environmental conditions, then we know that there's a function behind it. It's not just something that's, you know, done automatically reinforced or that there's no pattern to it. And we don't want to use it when the function is irrelevant. Not that function is always irrelevant, because it does, like I said, it informs what type of reinforcement to use. But does anybody have an example of behaviors where the function is not so important?
Riding a bike?
Yeah, I think the example you used in the last training was writing,
Writing.
where it's, you know, whether you're riding a bike or you're writing, we don't necessarily, it's not that we don't care, obviously, but it's not as important to us why they're engaging in that behavior, but they're doing it, and we want to reinforce that. So, you know, just having that behavior occur is sufficient in order to, you know, reinforce it. We don't necessarily need to understand why it's occurring. So I'll go back to the example I gave from one of my BSPs. This, I used both for this particular behavior, but the functional portion of the behavior is when client is denied access to desired items, activities, or given an aversive request, because in the past this behavior granted client access to items, activities, or aversive requests to be removed. That's the functional aspect of that definition, because it's keying not only us, but caregivers or anyone else involved with that client. This is why this behavior is happening. Yes.
Is it safe to say that the reason that behaviors are happening is because of the consequence? That's the best way for you to look to figure out the
Well,
consequence.
you would do, which yes, but you would also, your FBA, your QABF, and when you start to figure out what that intended consequence or that intended change in the environment is, that will cue you right into what the function is. So a lot of it's, again, like I was saying, yes, we don't just do observation, but observation's a huge part of what we do because that gives us, our function, that gives us our why. And if we know the why, we can manipulate, certain environmental factors. The other part of it is topographical. This is the physical form of the behavior, and this is super important. It's what does it look like, what it is not. Just an example from that same case from that physical aggression. That particular client does mock headbutting as a precursor behavior, where he will walk forward like this. That's not physical aggression. That's an escalation. It's a precursor behavior, but it is not physical aggression. And it doesn't always lead to an outburst of physical aggression. So in that instance, you would want to speak with the caregivers because they're going to be giving you ABC data. So if they say, so-and-so headbutted 3 times over the weekend, but it's the precursor of mock headbutting, that's inaccurate. So then, no, we don't have 3 instances of headbutting. So that's why it's important to say, what does it look like and what is it not? So when to incorporate it, that's if function is seemingly non-apparent, not that it doesn't exist, but it might just be take some more time to kind of peel the onion back and figure that out. But so does anybody know what type of function might fulfill this category? I'll give you a hint. It's the hardest one to discern or to treat.
Automatic reinforcement?
Yes, Brandon. Yes. There are sometimes people do things because it feels good. So doesn't mean that behavior does not have physical characteristics and we don't need to track it and provide interventions. But when it comes to that, the function is not necessarily apparent. And then, if we're collecting data on this behavior, the vast majority of times, you're going to want a topographical definition because otherwise you're trying to define something or you're trying to track something that's sort of, out there in the aether. Like you don't have it pinned down to a set defined characteristics.
I think sometimes like we want to teach the form of the behavior, right?
Mhm.
When I learned penmanship, for instance, my teacher cared a lot about how I held the pen,
Mhm.
right? So that could be the definition that they use to help teach me, right? So they don't really care about the function in this case; they care more about the form. Another example of like teaching a form behavior could be like throwing free throws,
Mhm.
right? There's a lot of form and positioning that go into that. So when you're teaching in this case, you might default to a more topographical definition because we care more about the setup. We care more about the actual behavior than the result, perhaps. So that's another reason why you might want to use a topographical definition. And I think another reason why you would want to use a functional definition and steer clear of a topographical definition is because a functional definition would capture all behaviors that led to similar functions, right, Mark?
Yeah. And I didn't put that in there. I should
That's
have.
okay. There's 2 things that
No,
I
you're
thought of,
absolutely though. You're right. Yeah.
So I could use a functional definition and say any behavior when presented with an adversive task led to a removal of homework. So that way I could capture every instance, no matter what the behavior looked like. If that was the function or that was the effect, I would still capture it on my data collection sheet.
And then I just have, again, same example. I just wanted to stick with this so it's, the same. But the topographical portion of this target behavior is client may slap with an open hand, repeatedly slam a closed fist on surfaces, bite headbutt, or engage in property destruction, defined as throwing items, food, and punching holes in walls. That gives you the physical form of that definition or of that behavior. It's concise, it's clear, It gives you all aspects of that behavior. It leaves nothing out. And should something else manifest that, it's a new aspect of that behavior, God forbid, but I will amend that as necessary. So now, keeping all that in mind, we actually have to write these and publish them in our BSPs. So when we're trying to figure out which behaviors to target, obviously you want to go through your FBA, your QABF, and your direct observations. Why should we not solely rely on indirect observations, though, when it comes to figuring out target behaviors?
Because they might not be accurate.
Right. So if that's largely, either self-reporting, which is not completely accurate, or reporting from family members or people that don't have the same level of objectivity that we do, and they're also not necessarily versed in behavior science, so we kind of need to. It helps get you within spitting distance of what you're going to work on, and it does help on some level to inform your decisions. But you got to go off your direct observations at the end of the day, and then also your ABC data collection, which again goes back to why we have to make sure that anything that we are targeting is well understood, observable, and measurable, because then our ABC data that our caregivers give us is going to be reflective of what we're actually tracking. And then, does the target behavior require functional, topographical definition, or both? When possible, again, I'm not a BCBA, but I would say use both as often as possible, unless those situations I spoke of before kind of pop up. But generally, you want to try to use both as much as feasible in those situations. And then once you get through that part, you're going to see what category do you want to place it in: weakening, strengthening, developing, all those sorts of things. Take it to supervision. Always consult your BCBA. Always consult your BCBA for accuracy prior to when you're implementing things. Discuss your progress, your setbacks, and then, like I said before, just be ready to amend your BSP as you need to. It's not that difficult. Then the last slide I have is just, this was something that it's interesting to me, but there's always that kind of hierarchy of, you could be dealing with a whole basket of maladaptive behaviors. Which ones are we putting the most energy into? So this kind of just gives a quick list and a hierarchy of, what we should be focusing on.
I am going to give you 9 considerations for prioritizing target behaviors. So number 1, this is the literal number 1 priority: behavior that poses a danger to the client or to others. Not much else to say about that. Number 2, behaviors that the client uses often, like going to the store, car seat, etc. Number 3, chronic, long-lasting behaviors or deficits, like loud vocalizations, limited self-help skills, limited communication, to name a few. Number 4, behaviors that will produce high rates of reinforcement, like buying something, soft skills, etc. Number 5, behaviors that are needed for future skill development and independent functioning, like certain prerequisite behaviors or behavior cups, pivotal behaviors. 6, behavior that will reduce negative or unwanted attention from others. You know what that is. And hey, I urge you not to prioritize behaviors that make other people feel better, but if a behavior is preventing the client from things they do, causing them harm, then this is important. Number 7, behaviors that will produce reinforcement for significant others. Okay, not what you think, but it's all about the stuff you wish your significant other would do, or but hygiene, to flush the toilet, help with some of the household chores. Number 8, behaviors that are likely to be changed. Behavior change that is last but not least, number 9, behavior change is cost effective. What is the cost and expected time commitment for behavior change? Is it reasonable? Which, by the way, cost shouldn't be a barrier if a behavior is. Okay? So write all that down because it's probably going to be on your test.
I love her. She's got a great channel, by the way. Because she chunks it up very briefly, so you can just, if you have a couple minutes, you can just click on it, watch a video quick, and then. But all right, so I just want to thank Mike, thank everybody for attending. That's all I got. There's my reference sheet, and hope you all have a great rest of your day.